Global Affairs Analyst at the Atlantic Council. Michael, thank you so much for joining us here on the programme. We've just gone through all of the developments and there have been a lot in the last sort of 24 hours. But I just want to shift your attention and focus to something else that happened today. Vladimir Putin meeting with Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan to talk about this sort of grain deal that's been at risk so many times and currently is just sort of, flailing and sitting there with no movement. But just bring us up to date on what happened with those at those talks today.
Sure. Well, let's just skip about 10 days back to the BRICS summit. I was there in Johannesburg, and it became clear then that Vladimir Putin was not interested in reopening the grain deal. He was, demanding very difficult stuff like relaxation of sanctions, as well as release of Russian fertilizer stuck in EU ports. So basically, I think the same thing, Yalda, was reiterated today to Mr. Erdogan. What struck me as kind of odd was that very little progress seemed to come out of that particular aspect of their talks. It was a bilateral talk as well. They talked a lot about Russian trade relations, nuclear power, that sort of thing. But knowing what we do with Mr. Erdogan, he's very reluctant to go into talks without coming out with anything in return. And here, all he said was basically that he's going to put together a list, him and his officials, of demands from the Russian side to reopen that Black Sea grain initiative deal and present it to the UN. But I think it'll have those elements which I told you about that we heard about at BRICS. So it's basically a non-starter.
Yeah, basically, because the Russians have said, we've got our demands, and until those aren't met, sure, we're happy to restart this, but you've got to meet our demands as well.
Exactly. And, even if the best were to happen and the deal were to be, the grain deal were to be reinstituted, what are the Russians doing in the meantime? They're bombing Ukrainian ports, the very ports which anchor that particular grain deal. So I think their end game behind the scenes kind of is to decimate Ukraine's ability to export, pretend that they're negotiating at the diplomatic table, and then try to shift world grain corridors to Russia. And that would be straight out of the Russian playbook, I think.
Michael, let's talk about some of these developments inside Ukraine. And of course, I'm referring to the defense minister being replaced. I mean, one of the most important posts. In the last few days, we heard murmurings that this was likely to happen. So it hasn't come as a complete surprise. But while we're not saying that the defense minister who's been pushed out is linked to corruption, certainly that department was.
Absolutely. And bad timing for these revelations to come out. And by the way, Yalda, these revelations were mostly unveiled by investigative journalists in Ukraine. But it did kind of put a bad facade on everything, especially when Ukraine is basically begging for tens of billions of dollars in reconstruction aid. Mr. Reznikov, he was actually very friendly to the media. I've been in press conferences with him in Odessa, and he had a good relationship with not only them, but also Western donors. Where you're sitting in London, there happens to be an empty ambassadorial post, and there's rumors in the Ukrainian media that Mr. Reznikov may be headed that way. But it's really, again, we can't overemphasize how important it is right now for Zelensky to send out those signals that, yes, we're tackling corruption seriously, especially in the defense sector. And
putting in someone like Rustem Umerov into that post, do you think that is the sort of ideal candidate right now?
Yeah, sure. He doesn't have a deep background in defense, but neither do defense ministers in some other countries that were recently appointed. But look, he as Paul mentioned, he's a Crimean Tatar, but also he's a Muslim, and he's built up very interesting relationships between Kiev and the Gulf states, for example, Saudi Arabia, which is why, Yalda, you saw Saudi Arabia for the first time as an interlocutor with Ukraine and Russia, negotiating POW exchanges, that sort of thing. So I think this is a very, very savvy move on behalf of Zelensky administration. And
are you saying that Mr. Umerov drove a lot of that behind the scenes?
He did, absolutely. He drove that, as well as he was involved in that Black Sea grain initiative deal. And interesting, also, he's from the opposition Holos party. So very, very savvy on the Zelensky administration to appoint someone like that, I think.
Michael, just bring us up to date. I know we spoke a little to Paul about it, but the counteroffensive, because there are reports coming out that the United States is now finally, after months, sort of saying, look, this counteroffensive is gaining ground, and the Ukrainians are doing better than expected.
Yeah, they are. I mean, to break through that first very heavily defended line, 2 or 3 more to go, was very significant. And the key here is to sever that land bridge that connects the Russian mainland with Crimea. But look, there are also 2 other front lines. One is those missile strikes, drone strikes that happen on Ukraine almost on a daily basis from Russia. And then the other is as well, Ukraine reaching far beyond and striking well within Russia with drones, bringing the war to ordinary Russians. So lots of interesting developments that fit together that I think puts Ukraine in a very strong position and puts Russia on the back foot.
Michael, always good to talk to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Around the world and across the UK, this is BBC News. Let's just look at some other stories.